came a long way from St. Louis. You climbed the ladder of success. I've seen the flashy foreign cars that were parked out in front of your fancy address. You came a long way from St. Louis. You broke a lot of... And here we go, kicking off another edition of the Radioactive Take. A narrow cast over YouTube, courtesy of Bryan Styble, longtime commercial news talk radio host, now working behind the microphone of WBQS News Talk Radio, a station that doesn't exist, but maybe oughta, as we propagate conversation at the speed of light, talking about whatever comes up, kicking around the culture, and propagating conversation at the speed of light all the way. Delighted to have you in the audience, and while everybody else is talking this 22nd of August, 2023, a Tuesday, we'll explain why on a future edition of the Radioactive Take, why Tuesdays are special to me. But this Tuesday, other people are talking about how Hurricane Harold is slamming into Corpus Christi and other portions of the Texas coast down there in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as talking about how people in Southern California are digging out, cleaning up from the mudslides left by Hurricane Hillary, which didn't live up to meteorological predictions, but still is causing a lot of heartache for the folks in Southern California, and we wish them good luck with that. And they're also talking, America is, about this new world's fastest female human. Sha'Carri Richardson is her name, and she did not set a record in the 100-meter dash, but she did win the race over there and is now being declared and celebrated as the world's fastest female human. But I might remind you that the late Flojo, Florence Griffith Joyner, is still the owner of the all-time record in the 100-meter dash. She died quite young, but was the darling, one of the darlings of the 1988 Summer Olympic Games up there in Seoul, South Korea. And had she not died at such an untimely age, I think she was in her early 40s, if even that, and if she was still around today, nobody could be calling her Sha'Carri Richardson the world's fastest female human, because Flojo has the record. But while other people are talking about those things, I thought I would talk on this edition of the Radioactive Take about overpopulation, global overpopulation. This piece I found on the internet, it is just a blog post, but this guy, Juliancribb, an Australian author who specializes in science, presumably knows what he's talking about, and his words do ring true to me, and we'll see what you have to think of them as we relate them to you under the headline, Has the Population Bomb Exploded? On November 15th, 2022, according to United Nations estimates, world population reached 8 billion. But what sort of world are these newborns inheriting, he asks. The scientific evidence already suggests our Earth has far more humans living at far higher levels of consumption and pollution than it can possibly carry in the long run. Overpopulation is not a matter for individual or group opinion or for ideology, he emphasizes. It is defined as the point when humanity begins to exceed and then destroy the resources that support and give it life. It can be measured with precision. In numerous ways, the evidence is accumulating that humans have overpopulated our planet by exceeding the boundaries that ensure the renewal of life. Early warnings of this danger were uttered by Paul Ehrlich in The Population Bomb. That was published back in 1962, you may recall, and also by the Club of Rome in Limits to Growth. That came a decade later in 1972. Yet these sober, firmly evidenced warnings have all been dismissed or belittled by various vested interests, political, religious, and commercial, who care less about the survival of humanity than what they can gain from it in the short run. Overpopulation is overpopulation is the word, I should say. No politician, priest, economist, or business executive dares utter. It is the unmentionable but inescapable elephant in the room of the human future. The advent of the 8 billionth little human gives us sober reason to reflect on the dangers of overpopulation. In the space of a single lifetime, our numbers have swollen from 2 billion to 8 billion and continue to burgeon at a rate of about 1%. That's 80 million each year. The resources needed to support such gigantic numbers will inevitably run out, and there will be an exceedingly painful crash. The other thing that has run off the rails is pollution. Humans release over 200 billion tons of waste into the biosphere every year, some 2.5 billion of which are chemicals, many of them toxic. This is having a dire effect on the ability of all forms of life, ourselves included, to survive in the long run. This widespread vanishing of insects, bees, frogs, and birds is almost certainly related to this uncontrolled toxic avalanche. So yes, the bomb has already exploded, though the full impact of the blast is yet to be felt. This raises the essential, though quite unpalatable, question of whether we must now take deliberate, voluntary, he emphasizes voluntary, steps to reduce the human population, along with its consumption and pollution, back to a size the Earth can sustain. Can we avoid a devastating crash? Voluntary population reduction is therefore about sparing billions of people needless, agonizing deaths by starvation, war, and disease, which will result in a collapse of our resources. To prevent the crash, we have to prevent and reverse the growth. I see no real alternative. Fortunately, a growing number of thinking people are embracing the idea of one child fewer per family, and many are even taking the decision to remain childless because they foresee what a child born today will face. If universal family planning is made available and one child fewer becomes an accepted global norm, then UN projections suggest it is possible to reduce the human population to 8.5 billion by the year 2100, and lower still beyond that. However, the scientific evidence suggests that this is still 3 times more than the Earth's carrying capacity, which is estimated to be about 2 to 2.5 billion people living at advanced living standards. That's key, the advanced living thing, because, it should be obvious. Anyway, for civilization to survive in the longer run, the global conversation now needs to turn to the best way to reduce our numbers in the least painful way and without coercion. Because, let there be no doubt, if we don't do it ourselves, then nature will do it for us. Sober warnings indeed from juliancribb, a Canberra-based Australian science author. And I know they sound Malthusian, and Malthus, Thomas Malthus, has been widely discredited. He wrote in, I believe, just a couple years before the 18th century turned into the 19th century, or transitioned into the 19th century. Thomas Malthus, Malthusian thinking, has been discredited because, just like Marx is now discredited because he is said to have not anticipated the rise and expansion and dominance of the middle class in Western societies, economies. Just like Marx has been discredited, so has Malthus. You may recall from high school, that's when I first heard about it. Maybe you heard about it in college. Maybe you never heard of Thomas Malthus. And that's too bad because he was an important thinker, whatever his currency is nowadays. And what he argued, Malthus did, was that while the food supply only can increase arithmetically, population, human and other animals as well, those populations increase geometrically. And if you don't understand the difference between arithmetic and geometric progressions, well, then you probably didn't pay attention in mathematics class in high school. No time to delineate that on this edition of the Radioactive Take, although there is time for a puff of the vape. Calms me down a little bit. Anyway, Malthusian thinking is discredited now. And in fact, The Population Bomb, a book I read in the summer between 8th and 9th grade. And yeah, it put the fear of God into me, into this non-believing guy. I have identified myself all along, including in previous editions of the Radioactive Take, as a militant agnostic. So the fear of God is just a metaphor for me, but yeah, I'm scared about population uncontrol, discontrol, whatever the word is. And I'll tell you who else was very concerned about it. He died more recently than Thomas Malthus, but he was a child of the 20th century, Isaac Asimov. And there's a shot of him hailing a cab in New York City. This part of the Radioactive and Xanadu Hall of Fame that hangs up on the wall. And it's the first thing you see when you enter my condo, which we call Xanadu, but with a Z, not like Citizen Kane's Xanadu. That was with an X. And the reason Asimov is in the Hall of Fame of Xanadu is because, like yours truly, the guy that brags about discussing everything from astronomy to zoology, Asimov wrote about everything from astronomy to zoology, and quite authoritatively. He's certainly the most knowledgeable person I've ever read, and sometimes I think he's also the most intelligent writer I've ever read. And I'm not talking about his science fiction. Let's get this straight. Whenever we cite Asimov, and we will frequently on many editions of the Radioactive Take, we're talking about his nonfiction. It's quite unfortunate that Asimov, Dr. Asimov, a professor for many years at Boston University Medical School, never met him, but came close a couple of times. And I did see him lecture along with John Kenneth Galbraith, but never got to meet him, and that's my fault. I had a chance not only to meet him, but to spend at least, I would imagine, 20 minutes in his office talking about how dazzled I was by the 75 or 80-odd books of his I read. And that's what's unfortunate about Asimov. Even though he wrote very nearly 500 books, that was his life's ambition. And when Barbara Walters asked him in an interview, Dr. Asimov, what would you do if you learned you only had 6 months to live? He answered brilliantly. He said, type faster. And in those days, he was working on his manual typewriter. He didn't even want to get an electric typewriter, although he did succumb to that urge eventually, and finally, towards the end of his life, was actually using a word processor, but only after so many of his friends implored him to. The problem with Asimov is everybody thinks of him these days as a science fiction writer, a first-rate science fiction writer for sure, but just a science fiction writer. And I'm here to tell you that his science factual work is not only much more interesting and much more enlightening, but also the bulk of his work. Out of those 500 books he wanted to finish, and I think the final number was something like 496 or something before he passed in 1992. On the same day as Sam Walton, by the way, April 6th, 1992 is when he died, and it was a sad day in the radioactive universe. When I read in Newsweek is what informed me that he had passed. No internet in those days, at least none that I had access to. And, I had a hard time suppressing the tears that almost came to my eyes there. Sitting in a Burger King in Sacramento is where I read of his passing. But again, when you think of Isaac Asimov And you'll be thinking about them a lot if you stay with us here on the Radioactive Take, especially if you're kind enough to subscribe or maybe even give us a thumbs up like. You'll hear about Asimov a lot. And in fact, many of the facts that I dispense on this narrowcast come right out of Asimov's nonfiction body of work. And again, out of those 490-odd books he published, I think probably about 425 of them were nonfiction. And that's where I got an awful lot of my knowledge that served me very well in my commercial news talk radio career, and I'd like to think is doing the same thing here at WBQS News Talk Radio. So Asimov was very, very worried about population. In fact, I think in one of the essays in which he addressed it, he declared it as humanity's most pressing concern, much like this fellow Julian Cribb, not Crab, Cribb, 2 B's in Cribb, by the way. So I'm of a similar mind, and I certainly was when Paul Ehrlich scared the heck out of me with the population bomb. And again, I know that he, Paul Ehrlich, and Malthus have been discredited, but I'm not so sure that they're not going to both enjoy a renaissance in acceptance, if not popularity, as the 21st century extends. And Paul Ehrlich, by the way, is still alive at age 91 to watch his predictions either come true or not come to pass. And I checked to be sure, and sure enough, Paul Ehrlich, has been true to his ideology because he only had one child, he and his wife. So he's not contributing to the population bomb, and neither am I. I'm childless, but I've got a good reason for being childless, and we'll explain that as well on a future edition of the Radioactive Take. In fact, you might say, well, yeah, obviously the reason is that Styble guy's got this Jerry Van Dyke mug, and that's the reason he's childless, because he, in turn, is wifeless, is spouseless, and the reason no woman will have him is because he looks like that. Well, you might be onto something there. But the truth is, I had a couple of women leave me over the years. I've been a serial monogamist ever since college, and proud of it. And 2 of the women I was involved with over the decades, when I said, no, I not only won't have children, I can't have children. And it's not because of any physiological abnormality. It's because of a genetic abnormality. I actually was born with a birth defect that I just cannot see any justification in passing on to a child, a daughter or a son. I lived with it for 4 years until my folks were generous enough to have it surgically corrected. Well, let's mention it right now. I might as well get this out. It's something I am not embarrassed about, but I'm certainly not proud of it either. I was born such that my ankles never touched the ground, or my heels, I should say. My ankle cords, they're called, were too short. And I was walking around as if I was in high heels for the first 4 years of my life. I only got one photograph that portrays this, but I remember it like yesterday, just like I remember that operation like yesterday that happened back in 1958. And thank God that Dr. Burst in St. Louis there was not just a competent surgeon, but a miraculous one from my point of view, because he not only corrected my walking as if on high heels problem, but he actually did so to the degree that I ran and finished the Boston Marathon in 1974, and I've been running ever since. I was running this afternoon, as a matter of fact, put in 3 miles and felt pretty good about it. Still do. But if I hadn't had that operation, I would be a freak. Hey, you might say I'm a freak anyway, but I would be obviously a freak, not just after I open my big mouth. And the point being that, well, I'm alive today because I didn't grow up in, say, ancient Greece, where I wouldn't have been allowed to grow up. They would have put me a couple of days after birth, after they noticed the genetic problem I had. And the reason I know it's genetic, even though I haven't had my genes tested, haven't gone that what do they call it, U23 or something, choice 23, whatever it is, where they check your 23 chromosomes and see what kind of problems might be inherent in your genome. Because it's in both legs, well, it has to be genetic. If it was just in one or the other ankle, well, then you could have just said, well, he is a freak of nature. But I've got it in both. And again, in ancient Greece, they would have put me up on a mountaintop to die of exposure a few days after birth. Or if I was in Nazi Germany, if they didn't figure out that I had converted to Judaism, they would have... Actually, it was before the Jews started being gassed. They were already rounded up, but they weren't being gassed as early as the handicapped were being exterminated by the Nazis. So if I would have been born into the Third Reich, you wouldn't be watching me over WBQS News Talk Radio or any other phony radio station. I wouldn't have survived into young adulthood. So that's why I don't have children. That's why a couple of women left me, because both of them had this crazy idea that I'm smarter than the average bear, as Yogi used to brag to Ranger Smith or his sidekick Boo Boo. I don't think I'm any smarter than the average person, but a couple of women did. Several women have told me that over the years, and these two women both said sayonara as soon as I made it clear that I not only wasn't going to have children, but I was unalterable in that decision. And I think it's a good decision. I know, that's almost practicing eugenics on a personal level. I wouldn't even say almost. I mean, it is practicing eugenics on a personal level. But I've said many times over my career as a radio talk show host that the Nazis gave eugenics a bad name. Even Margaret Sanger, who was a eugenicist, even she's fallen into disrepute, but I think that's unfortunate. I think she's one of the greats. I actually even considered her putting up her photograph framed, just like this one, along with Isaac Asimov and all the others in the Xanadu Hall of Fame. That's how much respect I have for the mother, if you will, of the Planned Parenthood movement. So that's why I don't have children. Not because of the overpopulation thing, although if I did have children, I would be mindful of that. I wouldn't have more than 3 at the most, probably only 2. I grew up in a 2-child household, and that's enough for me. And I'm sure it was enough for my parents, too. When they saw the newborn Bryan, they said, that's enough. No more mistakes. And I'm not talking about the mistake in my genetics that was... manifested in my strange ankles, but rather just my whole strange way of being. I'm sure as a kid it was clear that I wasn't your average youngster, and I'd like to think I was strange in a good sort of way. But that's a judgment that you and other people can make, not me. And again, if you adjudge this narrowcast to be of your liking, intellectually, informationally, or just entertainingly, well, then we'd be flattered if you give us the old up thumb in terms of pushing of the like button. And yeah, I don't like stealing the motif that Siskel and Ebert made so famous, but blame that one, I should say, on Mark Zuckerberg and the guys at Facebook, now known as Meta or whatever they're calling it this month. And by the way, I should also, on a future edition of the Radioactive Take, explain to you how I came in Chicago Chicago, as the locals pronounce it, how I came to share a desk with Roger Ebert. I kid you not, at WLS Television, right there on State Street, that great street in the famous Lyric. We had the same desk for several months. And admittedly, I wasn't a big fan of Ebert. I was much more partial to Siskel's reviews and his manner in which he presented his reviews, much more so than Ebert. But I wasn't given that choice. They said, use this desk, and it happens to be Roger Ebert's desk, so make sure you keep it neat. And I did. And I enjoyed talking to him the couple of times he stopped in and we crossed paths. But that will have to await a future edition of the Radioactive Take. Email comes to radioactiveseattle@gmail.com. And we'd love to hear from you, but not as much as we love having you in the audience here on YouTube. So with that said, we'll take another puff of the vape and offer you a left-handed salute from Florida, wishing you personal contentment, fine health, and only good luck. And we'll be back behind the WBQS microphone tomorrow. See you then.